The Colorado highlands in summer were a place of breathtaking beauty, where crystal lakes reflected snow-capped peaks and wildflowers carpeted the meadows in riots of color. But for Maeve O'Connor, the youngest daughter of struggling homesteader Jebediah O'Connor, the beauty of the land was overshadowed by the ugliness of human cruelty. At 19 years old and nearly 300 pounds, Maeve had endured a lifetime of mockery, whispers, and casual cruelty from the people of Clearwater Valley. The small frontier community was tight-knit in the way of isolated places, which meant everyone knew everyone's business, and Maeve's size had been the subject of gossip since she was a child. On this particular evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of amber and rose, Maeve had snuck away to Willow Lake for her weekly bath. The lake was a 20-minute walk from her family's modest homestead, tucked into a grove of aspens and willows that provided privacy from prying eyes. It was the one place Maeve felt truly comfortable, where she could immerse herself in the cool water without fear of judgment, where her body could simply exist without apology. She had checked carefully before undressing, scanning the shoreline and surrounding trees for any sign of other people. Satisfied that she was alone, Maeve had folded her clothes carefully on a flat rock near the water's edge, her worn cotton dress, her undergarments, her boots, and waded into the lake. The water was cold enough to make her gasp, fed by mountain snowmelt, but it felt glorious against her sun-warmed skin. She ducked under the surface, scrubbing at her hair and body with the rough soap she had brought, feeling the grime and sweat of a hard day's work wash away. She was completely submerged, her eyes closed as she rinsed soap from her hair, when she heard the voices, young male voices, laughing and jeering. Maeve's eyes flew open, and she surfaced with a gasp, water streaming down her face, her heart hammering with sudden terror. On the shore, clearly visible in the fading light, stood 3 boys from town, Tommy Grafton, Billy Herschel, and Pete Morrison, all around her age, all known troublemakers. "Well, well," Tommy called out, his voice dripping with false cheer. "Look what we've found, boys! A beached whale!" The other 2 laughed uproariously, slapping their thighs as if Tommy had said the wittiest thing imaginable. Maeve's face burned with humiliation as she sank deeper into the water, trying to cover herself despite the lake's opacity. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "This is private property." "So is that body of yours, but you're showing it off for anyone to see," Billy shot back, and the 3 dissolved into laughter again. Maeve's hands trembled as she realized her vulnerability. She was naked in the lake. The boys stood between her and her clothes, and the nearest homestead besides her own was miles away. "Please," she said, her voice breaking despite her efforts to stay calm, "just leave me alone. Go away and let me get dressed." "Oh, we'll leave," Tommy said with a wicked grin. Then, with theatrical slowness, he picked up Maeve's neatly folded dress from the rock. "But we're taking these with us. Consider it payment for the entertainment." "No!" Maeve cried out, starting toward the shore before remembering her nakedness and freezing in place. "Please don't. Those are my only good clothes. I need them." "Should have thought of that before you decided to go swimming like some kind of sea monster," Pete said, gathering up her undergarments and boots. "Come on, boys. Let's see how long it takes the whale to waddle home naked." Maeve's pleas turned to desperate sobs as the 3 young men ran off into the gathering twilight, carrying her clothes and laughing at their cruel prank. She stood waist deep in the lake, shaking with cold and humiliation, paralyzed by the realization of her situation. She was stranded, naked, with darkness falling and at least a 20-minute walk home through rough terrain. Even if she could bring herself to attempt the journey without clothes, there was no guarantee she would not encounter other people. The shame would be unbearable. "Please," she whispered to the empty air, to God or fate or anyone who might be listening, "please help me." For long minutes, nothing happened. The sun continued its descent, shadows lengthening across the water. Maeve's teeth began to chatter as the evening cold set in, her body losing heat to the mountain air. She was beginning to consider desperate options, using handfuls of willow branches to cover herself, or waiting until full dark and hoping she could make it home unseen, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching through the trees. New terror seized her. What if it was more townspeople come to gawk at her predicament? What if word had already spread about the boy's prank? But the rider who emerged from the aspen grove was not someone Maeve recognized from town. He was a tall man, powerfully built, sitting astride a magnificent chestnut horse. Even in the fading light, Maeve could see that he was ruggedly handsome, with dark hair touching his collar and a face weathered by sun and wind. He wore the simple but well-made clothes of a successful mountain man: leather vest, sturdy shirt, and worn boots that spoke of many miles traveled. The man, Silas Thornwood, though Maeve did not yet know his name, took in the scene with swift assessment. A young woman in the lake, clearly distressed and trying to cover herself. No clothes visible on the shore. The signs of a cruel prank were obvious to someone who had seen his share of human cruelty. He immediately averted his eyes and turned his horse so his back was to the lake. "Miss," he called out in a deep, calm voice that somehow cut through Maeve's panic, "I'm going to leave my coat on this rock here, and I'm going to ride about 50 yards back up the trail and wait with my back turned. You take whatever time you need to get out and cover yourself. When you're decent, call out, and I'll come help you however I can. All right?" Maeve could barely speak through her chattering teeth. "Thank you," she managed to stammer. True to his word, Silas dismounted, removed his heavy leather coat, and draped it over the rock where Maeve's clothes had been. Then he remounted and rode back up the trail, positioning himself so he was facing away from the lake. Maeve waited a few heartbeats to make sure he was not looking, then half ran, half stumbled out of the water, her skin pebbling with goosebumps in the cold evening air. She grabbed the coat and wrapped it around herself. It was enormous on her, but blessedly warm from his body heat, and long enough to cover her from shoulders to mid-thigh. "I'm covered," she called out, her voice still shaky. Silas turned his horse and rode back, keeping his eyes respectfully on her face. Up close, Maeve could see that he was perhaps in his mid-30s, with gray eyes that were kind, despite the hardness of his features. There was a scar along his jaw and another disappearing into his hairline, the marks of a man who had lived a rough life. "What happened?" he asked gently, dismounting and standing a respectful distance from her. "Some boys from town," Maeve said, tears streaming down her face now that someone was there to witness her distress. "They took my clothes as a prank. They called me names and laughed and just took everything." Anger flashed across Silas's face, there and gone so quickly, Maeve almost missed it. "That's not a prank, that's cruelty," he said flatly. "Do you live nearby? Can I escort you home?" Maeve nodded miserably. "The O'Connor homestead, about a mile that way," she said, pointing. "But I can't. Everyone will see me like this. They'll talk, they'll laugh. They'll see you being escorted home by someone who helped you after you were the victim of theft," Silas corrected firmly. "Anyone who has a problem with that can answer to me. Now, my horse can carry both of us if you're comfortable with that. Otherwise, I can walk alongside while you ride." The thought of walking a mile in nothing but his coat, even with his escort, was too much. Maeve nodded. "I'll ride, if you don't mind walking." "Not at all," Silas said. He helped her mount with surprising gentleness, his strong hand steadying her, but never lingering inappropriately. Then he took the reins and began leading the horse through the darkening woods toward the O'Connor homestead. They walked in silence for several minutes before Silas spoke. "My name's Silas Thornwood. I'm new to the valley. Just bought the old Henderson place up in the high meadows. I was riding the property boundaries when I heard someone calling for help." "I'm Maeve O'Connor," she said quietly. "Thank you for stopping. Most people wouldn't have." "Most people should," Silas said simply. "What happened to you was wrong, and those boys should be held accountable." Maeve shook her head bitterly. "They won't be. Their families are respected in town. I'm nobody. The fat girl everyone makes fun of. My word against theirs means nothing." Silas stopped walking and turned to look up at her, his gray eyes steady. "Miss O'Connor, I may be new here, but I've lived long enough to know that a person's worth isn't determined by their size or what cruel people say about them. You seem like a decent young woman who was trying to have a moment of peace and privacy, and you were violated by cowards who thought your humiliation was entertainment. That's not your shame to carry, it's theirs." His words were so unexpected, so different from anything Maeve had heard in her 19 years, that she started crying again. But these were different tears, not of humiliation, but of relief at finally being seen as something other than an object of mockery. They arrived at the O'Connor homestead just as full darkness fell. The small log cabin glowed with lamplight, and Maeve could see her father's silhouette moving past the window. Jebediah O'Connor was a hard man, worn down by years of struggling to make the homestead profitable after his wife Ilara's death 5 years ago. He had 3 daughters, but Maeve, as the youngest and largest, bore the brunt of his disappointment in how life had turned out. Silas helped Maeve down from the horse, steadying her as she wrapped his coat more tightly around herself. "I'll speak to your father," he said quietly. "Explain what happened. You go inside and get dressed." Before Maeve could respond, the cabin door flew open and Jebediah stormed out, his face red with anger. "Maeve, where the hell have you been? And who is this man? What in blazes are you doing coming home with a stranger wearing nothing but a coat?" "Mr. O'Connor," Silas said calmly, stepping forward, "my name is Silas Thornwood. Your daughter was the victim of a theft and harassment at Willow Lake. Some young men from town stole her clothes while she was bathing. I happened to be riding nearby, heard her distress, and offered assistance. She's been through a terrible ordeal and needs your support, not your anger." Jebediah's face went from red to purple. "Bathing in the lake? In public? What kind of—" "A young woman seeking privacy for a necessary task," Silas interrupted, his voice hardening, "which she had every right to do on what I understand is your family's property. The criminals here are the boys who stole from her and left her stranded, not your daughter who did nothing wrong." Maeve had never heard anyone speak to her father that way, challenge his authority so directly. Jebediah sputtered, clearly caught between his outrage and the uncomfortable realization that Silas was right. Maeve took advantage of the moment to slip past both men and into the cabin, where her older sisters, Sarah and Ruth, waited with wide eyes. "What happened?" Sarah whispered, as Maeve hurried toward the corner where she kept her spare clothes. "Tommy Grafton and his friend stole my clothes while I was bathing," Maeve said quietly, struggling not to cry again. "Mr. Thornwood helped me get home." Outside, she could hear Silas's deep voice continuing to speak to her father, though she could not make out the words. By the time she had dressed in her worn everyday dress and emerged from behind the curtain that provided minimal privacy in the one-room cabin, Silas and her father had come inside. "This is a serious matter," Silas was saying. "Those boys committed theft and harassment. They should face consequences." "And they will," Jebediah said, though his tone suggested he had no intention of pursuing the matter. "But right now, I need to thank you for helping my daughter and get you on your way. It's late, and I'm sure you have your own concerns." Silas looked like he wanted to argue, but he simply nodded and turned to Maeve. "Miss O'Connor, if you or your family need anything, I'm at the old Henderson place. Don't hesitate to reach out." "Thank you," Maeve said softly, holding his coat out to him. "For everything." "Keep it for now," Silas said. "Consider it a loan until you can get your own clothes back. I'll stop by in a few days to collect it, if that's all right with your father." Jebediah clearly was not thrilled by the idea of this stranger having an excuse to return, but he grudgingly nodded. After Silas left, he turned to Maeve with a mixture of disappointment and concern. "How could you be so careless? You know people talk. Now this will be all over town by tomorrow." "I wasn't careless," Maeve said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I was on our own property taking a bath. Those boys trespassed and stole from me. This isn't my fault, Papa." She expected anger, but instead, Jebediah just looked tired. "Maybe not, but it's still going to cause us problems. The Graftons have influence in town, and we need their goodwill." Maeve said nothing, but she thought bitterly that her family had never had the Graftons' goodwill, nor that of most of the town. The O'Connors were outsiders, Irish immigrants who had arrived 10 years ago with dreams of prosperity that had never materialized, and Maeve, with her size and her dreams of reading and learning instead of just working, had always been an embarrassment to her father. True to Jebediah's prediction, word of the incident spread through Clearwater Valley like wildfire, but the story that circulated was not the truth. According to town gossip, Maeve had been skinny-dipping shamelessly in full view of passers-by, and the boys had merely been trying to teach her modesty by removing her clothes. The arrival of a strange mountain man to escort her home in a state of undress only added fuel to the scandalous fire. Maeve endured the whispers and stares when she went into town for supplies 3 days later. Women clutched their children and hurried past her. Men made crude jokes just loud enough for her to hear. Even the shopkeeper, who had always been polite if not friendly, treated her with cold disdain. She was loading her purchases into the family wagon, tears of humiliation burning in her eyes, when a familiar voice spoke behind her. "Miss O'Connor, I was hoping I might run into you." Maeve turned to find Silas Thornwood standing there, his expression kind, despite the chaos of the busy town street. He looked different in the daylight, even more imposing, his muscular frame and weathered face marking him as someone who lived hard and worked harder. "Mr. Thornwood," Maeve said, wiping quickly at her eyes, "I still have your coat at home. I'm sorry I haven't returned it yet." "I'm not here for the coat," Silas said. "I'm here because I've been hearing some disturbing stories about what happened at the lake, and I wanted you to know that I've told anyone who would listen the truth. You were the victim, not the villain." "Thank you," Maeve whispered, "but I don't think it matters. People believe what they want to believe." "Maybe," Silas acknowledged, "but that doesn't make it right, and it doesn't mean we stop fighting for the truth." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "Miss O'Connor, I wonder if you might do me a favor. I'm new to the valley and still learning about the area. I could use someone to show me the best fishing spots, the safest trails, things like that. Would you be willing to act as a guide of sorts? I'd pay fairly for your time and knowledge." Maeve stared at him in astonishment. He was offering her work, offering her a way to earn money and get away from her father's homestead, away from the suffocating judgment of the town. "Why would you do that?" she asked suspiciously. "Why would you want to help me?" "Because you seem like a decent person who's been dealt an unfair hand," Silas said simply, "and because I could genuinely use your help. You grew up here. You know this land. That's valuable knowledge, Miss O'Connor." It was the same thing he had said before, that she had value, that she was worth something beyond her size or what others said about her. Maeve felt something shift inside her chest, a small crack in the armor of self-loathing she had built over the years. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll help you." Over the following weeks, Maeve met with Silas several times a week, showing him the best fishing streams, the safest mountain passes, the meadows where elk grazed and the caves where bears denned in winter. She taught him about the valley's seasonal rhythms, the relationships between the handful of homesteaders who called this isolated place home, and the uneasy peace between the settlers and the Apache bands who considered this their ancestral land. Silas proved to be an apt student and, more surprisingly, a genuine friend. He listened when Maeve talked, asked her opinions, and treated her observations as valuable rather than dismissing them as a woman's fancy. He never mentioned her size, never made her feel self-conscious about eating the lunch they shared on their excursions, never looked at her with pity or disgust. "You're very knowledgeable about the land," he said one afternoon as they sat beside a crystal stream, eating sandwiches Maeve had packed. "Who taught you all this?" "My mother," Maeve said softly. "Before she died, she used to take me on long walks, teaching me about plants and animals, about reading the weather and the seasons. She said the land would take care of us if we learned to listen to it." "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Maeve agreed. "She was also the only person who never made me feel like my size was something to be ashamed of. She said bodies came in all shapes, and what mattered was whether you were strong and capable. After she died, everything got harder." Silas was quiet for a moment, then said, "My mother used to say something similar. She told me that character was built through adversity, and the strongest people were often those who had faced the most challenges." "Was she right?" Maeve asked. "I think so," Silas said. "You're one of the strongest people I've met, Miss O'Connor. You face cruelty and judgment every day, but you keep going. You take care of your family, you know this land better than anyone, and you've maintained your kindness despite every reason to become bitter. That takes real strength." Maeve felt tears prick her eyes again. In all her 19 years, no one except her mother had spoken to her this way, had seen her as strong rather than weak, capable rather than burdensome. It was during one of these expeditions, about 6 weeks after their first meeting, that everything changed. They had ridden up to the high meadow where wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, painting the landscape in purples and golds. Maeve was showing Silas a particular vantage point that offered views of the entire valley. When they saw it, a group of men in suits and expensive boots, accompanied by local workers, driving survey stakes into the ground near Willow Lake. "What are they doing?" Silas asked, his voice sharp with concern. Maeve's heart sank as understanding dawned. "The railroad," she whispered. "Papa mentioned they were surveying routes through the valley, but I didn't think they'd come this close to our land." They rode down to investigate, arriving just as one of the suited men, clearly the surveyor in charge, was consulting a map and gesturing broadly toward the lake. He was a tall, thin man with a neatly trimmed beard and cold eyes that assessed everything in terms of profit and loss. "Excuse me," Silas called out as they approached. "What's going on here?" The surveyor looked up with poorly concealed irritation. "Railroad business. The Denver and Northern Line is planning a route through this valley. We're surveying for the best path and identifying necessary resources." "This is O'Connor land," Maeve said, her voice stronger than she felt. "You can't just survey it without permission." "Actually, miss, we can," the surveyor said with a condescending smile. "The railroad has an agreement with Mr. Jebediah O'Connor to survey his property in exchange for a small fee. And furthermore, we've identified this lake as a crucial water source for our operations. We'll be filing claims for water rights." Maeve felt the blood drain from her face. "Water rights? But we need that lake. It's our only reliable water source. Without it, you'll need to find alternatives," the surveyor interrupted. "Progress requires sacrifice, Miss O'Connor. The railroad will bring prosperity to this valley. Your family's small inconvenience is a small price to pay." "Small inconvenience?" Silas's voice was dangerously quiet. "You're talking about taking the water that sustains their homestead, their livestock, their survival. That's not an inconvenience. That's theft." The surveyor's eyes narrowed. "And who might you be?" "Silas Thornwood. I own the Henderson property, which means I'm your neighbor, and I have a vested interest in how this valley is developed. If the railroad takes the O'Connor's water, what's to stop you from coming for mine next?" "The railroad operates within legal frameworks, Mr. Thornwood. If you have concerns, I suggest you take them up with your lawyer. Now, we have work to do, so if you'll excuse us." As they rode back toward the O'Connor homestead, Maeve was silent, her mind racing. The lake had been her mother's favorite place. Alara O'Connor had spent hours there, teaching Maeve to swim, to identify water plants, to appreciate the beauty of the natural world. More than that, it was the lifeblood of their homestead. Without it, they would have to haul water miles from the nearest stream, a task that would consume hours every day and strain their already limited resources. "There has to be something we can do," she said finally. "Some way to fight this." "There might be," Silas said thoughtfully. "Water rights in the territory are complex. If your family has a prior claim to the lake, If they were using it before the railroad showed interest, they might have legal standing to oppose the takeover. But we'd need documentation, proof of your family's historical use. Maeve's mind suddenly sparked with a memory. "My mother," she said slowly. "Before she died, she told me she had important papers hidden in her Bible. She made me promise to look at them when I was old enough to understand their value. But after she passed, Papa was so grief-stricken and angry that I never—" "It's worth checking," Silas said. "If those papers establish your family's water rights, they could be exactly what we need." That evening, after her father and sisters had gone to sleep, Maeve carefully retrieved her mother's worn Bible from its place in the small trunk that held Ilara's few possessions. She had not opened it in years, the pain of her mother's loss too fresh even after 5 years. But now, with trembling fingers, she leafed through the pages until she found what her mother had hidden. Tucked between the pages of Psalms were 3 documents, carefully folded and preserved. The first was a marriage certificate showing that Ilara Brennan had married Jebediah O'Connor in Denver in 1855. The second was a property deed, transferred to Ilara alone before the marriage, showing that she had inherited 200 acres in the Colorado Highlands from her uncle, including all water rights, mineral rights, and natural resources therein. But it was the third document that made Maeve's breath catch. It was a codicil to Ilara's will, written in her mother's careful hand and properly witnessed, stating that upon her death all property rights originally granted to her, including the critical water rights, would pass not to her husband, but to her youngest daughter, Maeve O'Connor. There was a note attached in Ilara's handwriting. "To my dearest Maeve, this land and its water are your birthright and your security. Your father is a good man, but not a careful one with resources. I trust you to protect what matters. All my love, Mama." Maeve sat in the darkness, tears streaming down her face as she held these precious papers, her mother's final gift, her protection even from beyond the grave. Ilara had known somehow that the water would become valuable, that Maeve would need leverage and security in a world that did not value women like her. She had provided for her daughter in the only way she could. The next morning, Maeve showed the documents to Silas. His eyes widened as he read them, particularly the codicil granting her the water rights. "This changes everything," he said. "According to this, you're the legal owner of the water rights to Willow Lake, not your father. The railroad can't claim them without your permission, and your father had no legal authority to grant them access." "Will it be enough?" Maeve asked, hardly daring to hope. "It should be," Silas said. "These documents are properly executed and witnessed, but we need to file them officially with the county clerk and then confront the railroad with the legal facts. Are you prepared for that? It won't be easy. Your father is going to be angry that your mother left the rights to you instead of him, and the railroad won't back down without a fight." Maeve thought about her mother, about the countless times Ilara had told her she was strong, capable, meant for more than the narrow life the world tried to force her into. She thought about the lake, her sanctuary, the place where she had felt most at peace. And she thought about the future, not just her own, but the future of this valley and everyone who depended on its resources. "I'm prepared," she said firmly. "Let's do this." The following week, Maeve and Silas made the 2-day journey to the county seat, where they filed her mother's will and the property documents with the county clerk. The clerk, a meticulous man named Harrison, examined the papers carefully and confirm their validity. "These are in order," he said, stamping them officially. "As of this moment, Miss O'Connor, you are the legal owner of the water rights to Willow Lake. Any attempts by other parties to claim or sell those rights without your consent are null and void." Armed with official copies of the filed documents, they returned to Clearwater Valley to find that the railroad had wasted no time. A town meeting had been called, with the railroad's representatives there to present their plans, and Maeve suspected to pressure the local homesteaders into cooperation. The meeting was held in the church, the only building large enough to hold most of the valley's residents. Maeve entered with Silas at her side, her mother's documents clutched in her hand. The room fell silent as people turned to stare, whispers rippling through the crowd. She could feel the weight of their judgment, their mockery, their contempt, but she held her head high, remembering Silas's words. "This isn't your shame to carry, it's theirs." Jebediah sat near the front with Sarah and Ruth, his face darkening when he saw Maeve enter. He had been furious when she disappeared for 2 days without explanation, and even more furious when he learned she had gone to the county seat with Silas. But Maeve had refused to explain, knowing that what she had to say needed to be said publicly, where her father could not simply silence her. The railroad surveyor, whose name Maeve had learned was Cornelius Blackwell, stood at the front of the church, flanked by 2 lawyers in expensive suits. He was in the middle of explaining how the railroad would bring prosperity to the valley, how it would open markets for their goods, and bring civilization to this isolated corner of the territory. "Of course, such progress requires cooperation," Blackwell was saying. "We'll need access to certain resources, including water rights for our operations. We're prepared to compensate landowners fairly for any inconvenience." "Except the compensation you're offering wouldn't begin to cover the actual cost," a voice called out. Heads turned to see an elderly Apache man standing in the back of the church. Maeve recognized him as Kitchi, a respected scout who often acted as liaison between the Apache bands and the settlers. "You speak of progress, but what you bring is destruction. Already your surveyors have disrupted sacred sites and fouled streams with their equipment." "Mr. Kitchi, with all due respect," Blackwell said smoothly, "the railroad represents the future. Your people will benefit from the trade opportunities and access to goods that our line will provide." "My people will benefit from keeping our land and water intact," Kitchi replied, "as will all who call this valley home. But you seek to take what is not yours to take." "Actually, we have agreements with the landowners," Blackwell countered. He pulled out a sheaf of papers, "including Mr. Jebediah O'Connor, who has granted us surveying rights and provisional water rights to Willow Lake." "My father had no right to grant those rights," Maeve said, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. She walked down the aisle toward the front of the church, ignoring the stares and whispers. "Because he doesn't own them. I do." The church erupted in shocked voices. Jebediah half rose from his seat, his face purple with rage. "Maeve, sit down. You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about, Papa," Maeve said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She turned to face Blackwell. "My mother, Elara O'Connor, owned the property that includes Willow Lake through an inheritance from her uncle. When she died, she left the water rights specifically to me, not to her husband. I have the legal documents, properly filed with the county clerk, proving my ownership." She held up the papers, and the church fell silent. Blackwell's confident expression faltered. "That's impossible." Mr. O'Connor assured us, "My father either didn't know about my mother's will or chose to ignore it." Maeve interrupted. "Either way, any agreement you made with him regarding water rights is invalid. Those rights are mine, and I'm not granting them to the railroad." "Now see here, young lady," one of the lawyers began, but Silas stepped forward, his imposing presence commanding immediate attention. "The lady has spoken," he said quietly. "Her claim is legal and properly documented. If you attempt to take water rights she legally owns, you'll be committing theft, and I guarantee you'll face legal action, not just from Miss O'Connor, but from every landowner in this valley who's watching to see if the railroad respects property rights or simply tramples them." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The settlers might have been willing to cooperate with the railroad when it seemed inevitable, but the idea of property rights being violated struck at the heart of their existence. If the railroad could take one person's water, they could take anyone's land. Kitchie stepped forward to stand beside Maeve and Silas. "The Apache people stand with Miss O'Connor," he said. "This valley has sustained life for generations. We will not allow it to be destroyed for the railroad's profit." Blackwell looked around the church, clearly recognizing that the tide had turned against him. His smooth confidence had evaporated, replaced by cold calculation. "Very well," he said. "If Miss O'Connor owns the water rights, then we'll negotiate with her. Surely we can come to an agreement that benefits everyone?" "No," Maeve said simply. The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water. "I'm not interested in negotiating. Willow Lake is not for sale at any price. Find another route for your railroad, one that doesn't require taking what's not yours." "You're making a mistake," Blackwell said, his voice hardening. "The railroad will come through this valley one way or another. You can cooperate and profit, or you can stand in the way and be crushed. Your choice, Miss O'Connor." "She's not alone," Silas said, his hand moving to rest on Maeve's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. "If the railroad tries to intimidate or harm her, they'll answer to me, and I suspect to quite a few others in this valley who are tired of being pushed around." Heads nodded throughout the church. Even Jebediah, though he looked furious and humiliated, said nothing to contradict his daughter. He knew Maeve was right, that Elara had left the water rights to her youngest daughter for exactly this reason, to protect them from his impulsive decisions. The meeting broke up in chaos, with the railroad representatives retreating to consider their options and the townspeople buzzing with discussion. Maeve found herself surrounded by people offering congratulations and support, including several women who had previously avoided her. It was a strange feeling, being the center of positive attention rather than mockery. But the victory was short-lived. Over the next several weeks, the railroad escalated its pressure. Blackwell and his lawyers filed legal challenges to Maeve's ownership, claiming procedural irregularities in how the documents had been filed. They offered increasingly large sums of money for the water rights, trying to tempt Maeve with wealth beyond anything she had ever imagined. When she refused every offer, the tactics turned darker. Strange men began watching the O'Connor homestead. Equipment on neighboring properties was mysteriously damaged, with whispers that the same would happen to anyone who opposed the railroad's plans. And the social pressure intensified. Storekeepers who had begun treating Maeve with respect suddenly turned cold again, clearly having been pressured by railroad money and influence. Through it all, Silas remained steadfast. He stayed close to the O'Connor homestead, helping with repairs and chores, making it clear that Maeve was under his protection. He taught her practical skills: how to shoot, how to read survey maps, how to recognize the signs of tampering or sabotage. More than that, he continued to treat her with the respect and kindness that had first drawn her to trust him. "Why are you doing all this?" Maeve asked him one evening as they sat on the O'Connor porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. "You could walk away. This isn't your fight." "It is my fight," Silas said, "because I live in this valley too, and what happens here affects everyone. Because the railroad's tactics are wrong and need to be opposed, and because—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Because you matter, Maeve. Your courage matters. The stand you're taking matters. I won't abandon you to face this alone." Maeve felt her heart swell with an emotion she had not dared to name. It was more than gratitude, deeper than friendship. She was falling in love with this complicated, kind man who saw her true self and valued it. The crisis came to a head in late autumn, just as the first snows began dusting the high peaks. Blackwell arrived at the O'Connor homestead with the local sheriff and a court order, claiming that new evidence had emerged showing Alara's will was invalid due to lack of proper witnesses. If Maeve could not provide additional proof of the will's legitimacy, the water rights would revert to Jebediah, who had already agreed to sell them to the railroad. Maeve's heart sank as she read the court order. Her mother's will had been witnessed by two people, a doctor who had since died and a neighbor who had moved away years ago. Without them, it would be her word against the railroad's expensive lawyers. But Kitchie, who had been helping Silas repair a fence line when the sheriff arrived, stepped forward. "I witnessed Alara O'Connor's will," he said calmly. "I was there when she signed it, along with Dr. Morrison and Mrs. Chen. Mrs. O'Connor asked me specifically because she trusted the Apache to honor written agreements, even when they were not made by our people." "You?" Blackwell sneered. "The word of a savage is hardly—" "The word of a man who has lived honorably for 60 years carries considerable weight," the sheriff interrupted, surprising everyone. He was a fair man, if somewhat weak when it came to standing up to powerful interests, but even he had his limits. "Mr. Kitchie is a respected member of this community, and if he says he witnessed the will, that's good enough for me." "It won't be good enough for the court," Blackwell snapped. "Actually, it will be," a new voice said. Everyone turned to see a woman stepping down from a buggy that had just arrived, Margaret Chen, the very neighbor who had supposedly moved away. She was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. "I received a telegram from my cousin in town saying my testimony was needed. I'm prepared to swear that I witnessed Alara O'Connor's will, and that it was properly executed according to territorial law." Blackwell's face went white with rage. "This is a conspiracy. You people have coordinated this—" "We've done nothing but tell the truth," Silas said quietly. "Unlike you, who've lied, intimidated, and attempted to steal land through fraud. Sheriff, I believe you have enough evidence now to confirm that Miss O'Connor's claim is legitimate." The sheriff nodded slowly. "I do. Mr. Blackwell, I'm sorry, but the court order is based on false premises. Miss O'Connor's ownership of the water rights stands." In the days that followed, the railroad made one final attempt to acquire the water rights through legal channels. But with Kitchy's and Mrs. Chen's testimony confirmed in court, the case was closed. Maeve was the legal owner, and no amount of money or pressure would change that fact. Defeated, the railroad announced it would route its line through a different valley, one where water was more readily available and local opposition less organized. Clearwater Valley would remain isolated for now, but it would remain theirs. The victory was celebrated with a community gathering at Willow Lake, where Maeve was toasted as a hero by people who had once mocked her. It was surreal and overwhelming, but what mattered most to her was her father's quiet apology. "Your mother would be proud of you," Jebediah said gruffly, his eyes wet with unshed tears. "I should have trusted her judgment, should have known she left those rights to you for a good reason. You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for, daughter." "I learned from Mama," Maeve said softly. "She taught me that strength comes in many forms, that courage means standing up for what's right even when you're afraid." As the celebration continued around her, Maeve found herself standing at the lake's edge with Silas, watching the sun paint the water gold and crimson. "What will you do now?" Silas asked. "You've won. The railroad is gone. You have legal ownership of valuable property. You could sell it, move away, start fresh somewhere that people don't know your history." Maeve considered this, then shook her head. "This is my home," she said simply. "This valley, this lake, they're part of me. And for the first time in my life, people here are seeing me as something other than the fat girl to be pitied or mocked. I want to stay, to keep being part of this community." She paused, then added softly, "And I want to see where things go with you if you're interested." Silas smiled, that rare, warm expression that transformed his harsh features. "I'm very interested," he said. "In fact, I was hoping you might consider marrying me, once a respectable amount of time has passed and we've properly courted. I know I'm not much of a catch-a-rough mountain man with a past I don't talk about and a future that's uncertain. But I love you, Maeve O'Connor. I love your strength, your kindness, your intelligence. I love the way you see the world, and I'd be honored if you'd consider building a life with me." Tears streamed down Maeve's face, but for the first time in her memory, they were tears of pure joy. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at once. "Yes, I'll marry you. I love you too, Silas Thornwood, and I can't imagine a future without you in it." They married the following spring, in a simple ceremony at Willow Lake, with the entire valley in attendance. Even the Apache bands sent representatives, honoring the alliance that had protected the water and the land. Kitchy performed a blessing, speaking of the strength that comes from unlikely friendships and the power of standing together against injustice. As Maeve stood beside Silas, his hand warm and strong in hers, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been stripped of her dignity, literally and figuratively, by cruel people who saw only her size and not her worth. But from that lowest point, she had found her voice, her strength, and her purpose. She had discovered that she was not the burden her family and society had told her she was, but a person of value, capable of courage and leadership. Most importantly, she had learned that true strength came not from conforming to others' expectations, but from standing firm in your own truth, from protecting what mattered, and from opening your heart to love even when the world told you that you were unworthy of it. The girl who had once begged for help, naked and ashamed in a cold lake, had become a woman who commanded respect, who had saved her valley, and who had found a love that saw past every imperfection to the magnificent person beneath. And as she kissed her husband under the Colorado sky, with the lake sparkling behind them and friends and family cheering their union, Maeve O'Connor Thornwood knew that she had finally, truly, come home not just to a place, but to herself.